So we have all this array of things, but there's still a puzzle, and that is that the large brain that could do all of this stuff was created 200,000 years ago. If conventional Darwinian selection is correct, the environment that needed that large brain and could use that large brain to give an adaptive advantage was there at the time. So immediately the large brain would have to be used to do something special that Homo erectus had not done. And there is no evidence as far, I'm not an expert in paleoanthropology, but I don't see any evidence of a massive change in the organization of behavior from what we know of early hominids. What we do know is that early hominids lived in relatively small social groups, probably 10 to 20 people. Almost certainly there's some kind of male-dominant hierarchy. There were hunting trips where individuals would go out, males would go out and hunt. Females did all the hard work locally. There were probably ceremonies and so on. There was the use of tools, but that already was true in Erectus. Fire already existed. So it's very hard to see what suddenly changed. Looks just like a modern-day chimpanzee, except for the fire. So, it's very hard to believe that this massive expansion of the brain was just about the minute differences between Homo sapiens, early Homo sapiens behavior, and late Homo erectus behavior. That's the problem. Well, here we see the conventional view expressed by a good friend of mine, Stephen Oppenheimer, who's some physician but also geneticist interested in evolution. In his book, What Makes Us Human, he says, the idea that we somehow grew a big brain first, then decided what it was for after growing it, is a negation of the principles of natural selection. What it is. New kinds of behavior precede the physical adaptation that evolves to better exploit that behavior. That's the conventional Darwinian line. So he's just restating it. There must have been some advantage that those big brains had that they used at the time, and that's what created the new species. However, in the same book, he publishes this graph, and this is his interpretation from all the evidence of the way in which the size of the brain has changed over time in 1.5 million years, right? Ending up with Homo sapiens. And this is what he calls, and quite how he's been able to put numbers on it, I'm not sure, but it's what he calls technical cultural innovation. Technical cultural innovation. Things like tools, stone tools, Middle Paleolithic here. We've got long distance exchange. Can't really read it here, but it's things like trading, exploration, decoration and art. And then you get into this really amazing exponential function in the last 500 years. Reading and writing, development of the printing press, science, computing, going to the moon, all of that stuff, that's all here. Massively, exponentially rising creativity. And of course, it's all done with the same brain that we had 200,000 years ago here. So there's no evidence that all the things that our big brain is capable of doing were suddenly being done then to give that species an advantage, which made it selected. So it's a very curious paradox that the brain grew so big, which is very expensive in biological terms because of the energy. It can do all of these amazing things, but it didn't do them until 100,000 years or more later. And it's continuing to do it, whatever it is, with no obvious genetic change. This leads all kinds of puzzles which are not, I think, adequately explained by conventional Darwinism. So what are they explained by? This is, by the way, the front cover of the book produced for an exhibition at the British Museum a few years ago on Ice Age art. It had all of the best known and most wonderful artifacts made in the Neolithic period and onwards from 50,000 years ago. Amazing. And as you can see, the writer, Jill Cork, the curator of this exhibition, clearly thought that was really the beginning of the onset of the human mind. I think some people would say our minds now are different from those of Neolithic humans. We continue to grow in the complexity of our ability to think and understand, But this is still 60,000 years ago, whereas the genetic changes all happened 200,000 years ago. So whenever you think the modern mind began, it certainly did not begin 200,000 years ago, when the modern brain was apparently completely formed already. So what's the explanation? We're getting close. But to get close, we have to go back into, this is the 17th century. This remarkable man, Thomas Willis, one of the group of extraordinary artists and scientists living in Oxford during the Civil War in Britain, who established the Royal Society, not quite the first Academy of Sciences, but certainly the most influential in its time. He was an amazing man. He was a physician, but a very skilled physician as well. He gave the first clinical descriptions of many conditions, including diabetes and its various forms, including schizophrenia, including a variety of auditory disorders as well. And he was also a neuroscientist. He dissected brains, the brains of animals and of human beings, and compared them. And his descriptions are almost Darwinian, because he makes comparisons between the brains of different species, which he then tries to relate to differences in their behavior and their style of life. It's a very modern approach. And when he looked at the human brain, the most distinctive thing about it that he saw was, of course, immediately its size. This is a drawing from his book, 1664, Cerebri Anatomy. And by the way, the drawing was done by his laboratory assistant, whose name was Christopher Wren. Wren was also in Oxford at the time. Wren was a very eminent mathematician and scientist, and worked along with Willis on these early observations on the brain before he was appointed to rebuild the buildings of the ecclesiastical buildings of London after the Great Fire. So here was Wren working with Willis, beavering away at the bench, cutting up brains and producing wonderful illustrations of them. So here's the human brain. And Willis saw that the cerebral cortex was so much bigger than any other species that he dissected. So he said, okay, the cerebral cortex must be responsible for the things that are special about humans. And to him, the things that were special were, as he said, ideation, imagination, perception, memory, thought. Actually, the kinds of things that we would nowadays say the cerebral cortex is responsible for. Just two quotes from Willis. The cerebrum, that's the cerebral hemispheres, is the primary seat of the rational soul. Rational meaning intelligent, reasoning, ratio, Latin, the reasoning soul, or mind, if you like. The animal spirits, now this is okay, so it takes a little bit of explanation. This term animal spirits is very widely used in medieval literature to describe the fluid inside the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid, because great significance was attached to the fluid. In fact, until Willis, no one thought that the tissue of the brain did anything useful except to make enclosures for the fluids to move around inside. The fluid is cerebrospinal fluid, it's a clear fluid, and people thought that that's really where the soul was. So Willis was halfway between accepting the old views and creating very new ones. He says, the animal spirits, the fluids, for the various acts of imagination and memory, ought to be moved within certain and distinct, limited or bounded places. This is the first statement of localization of function in the brain. Different aspects of memory and imagination, if you like, were due to movement of the fluid in different parts of the brain. First time anyone had suggested that different bits of the brain are doing different jobs. And now for me, this is the key to the question I'm asking about why the Stone Age brain is now doing the remarkable things today that it does. Exactly the same genetically, as far as we know, genetically and basically structurally. Right. He's describing the surface of the brain, the folded surface. These folds, or rollings about, are far more and greater in a man than in any other living creature. It's bigger. To wit, for the various and manifold actions of the superior faculties. Because we have all these superior faculties, thought, imagination, reasoning, language, we need a bigger brain. But they are garnished with an uncertain, as it were, fortuitous series. He's saying that the detailed structure of the brain varies from one person to another, which is true. Little tiny variations in the folds and shape. As that the exercises of the animal, that means the mind function, might be free and changeable. This is the first suggestion, and the only suggestion for 300 years, that the brain might be capable of changing itself. So he's saying that when you look at different human brains, there's small differences in them. That must be the result of differences in mental function. So he's saying the brain can change itself through mental activity.